He said he's here. Okay, so sorry, it's Jeff Parker from Dartmouth College, USA. And the title of his presentation is The Transformative Powers of Platform Economies.
All right.
I will raise the 5 minutes.
Yeah. And I will find my water. That was great, by the way. Thank you. It has Parker on the end. It's got to be that one. Yeah, I can never use these things. So.
Yeah, I hate
Yeah. I just. There we go. Okay. So this was the beginning title, but I like the one that you put in the program much better. So thank you. And thank you for having me here. And I absolutely loved the talk that Helga just gave. So one of the things that I struggled with in grad school was, do I go to a program in management science, kind of industrial engineering, or I do the history of science and technology? And now I get to see what I should have been doing, or at least could have been doing. So thank you for sharing that. So let's see. I want to go through a few things, and I'm cognizant that we have about 40 minutes. First, and this is probably a review or at least common material for at least some fraction, but I think it helps to level set and just talk about some definitions, especially when we talk about platforms. That's a very elastic term, and we're often in danger of if everything's a platform, then nothing is. And so I'm going to try to narrow that down at least a little bit, but probably not enough. Then I want to talk probably the bulk in the middle, and really touch on what Moshe talked about right at the end, the implications of falling transaction costs, and then why those reductions, I think, have had some really big implications in the structure of industry and firms, and then sort of go through. And then I'll conclude with some implications, but honestly, we could talk about that for an hour. So you will have a very light touch, and then we'll just have some discussion. So again, just some background. And I think it's kind of fun to show a chart like this. So what this shows you is if you take, this is for sort of the finance people in the room or anybody that's read their retirement statement. This is what we call the tangibles and intangibles. So if I look through the balance sheet of a company and I say, well, what fraction of the assets are tangible? And then I can correlate those to the market capitalization. And so this is sort of the top 500 firms. So I was an engineer, then I was a finance guy at GE, and one of the things I did in the mid-'80s was to go count stuff. It's called a physical inventory. You have to do it once a year. Anybody that's been in retail does this, because nobody trusts the computers. Now we could chip them all, but this was back in the day. You actually have to go count. Oh, there's a CAT scanner, there's an MRI, and there's a bunch of bar stock, and we keep the sort of expensive metals behind locked doors. And it used to be, when I did this, that about 2/3 of the stuff you could actually lay your hands on. It was actually stuff. And the rest of it was intellectual property brand. Well, that's completely flipped. Now, the majority of the value is very difficult to attribute to atoms, and it's mostly connections. I mean, some of it is intellectual properties, a lot of it is brand, but a lot of it is simply sort of affiliated user bases that then have the ability to be monetized, primarily through advertising, but in many other ways, the collection of data, the aggregation and creation of services. And so if you think about just what a dramatic change that is in just 30 years, I think that ties nicely to what Moshe discussed yesterday. And you can see it in sort of financials. And then if I tie back to Helga, we don't have a regulatory regime that can even count this stuff. I mean, there's no audit of, where's my network effect, essentially, that I could really understand how people are counting and appropriately sort of measuring these things. So there's a lot of work to do in lots of sectors, not just sort of in government, but even firms have a hard time with this. So again, I grew up sort of in this era of stuff, and we talked about things like the majors. So the majors, oil and gas companies, so to think BP, Exxon, Shell. Of course, now we've discovered finally that Saudi Aramco opened its books, that it's bigger than most of tech combined. But if you stick with the kind of Totals, BPs, those sorts of firms, you get about $1.5 trillion. And then the banking sector was the other kind of giant side. But, of course, what's happened in the last 10 years or so is that those have been eclipsed. And in fact, many of these firms could be bought out of the spare cash sitting on the balance sheets of some of the major tech firms. Granted, it's all stuck in Ireland because of sort of tax reasons, but assuming you could sort of repatriate it, there's a lot of it sloshing around. And this gets to a lot of anxiety in a lot of industries. They say, well, I started studying this stuff, I don't know, about 20 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. Mostly just asking, why is my idiosyncratic television preferences, why do they keep getting canceled? Things like Twin Peaks. Now, of course, that wouldn't happen because we can narrowly tailor content. But at the time, it took advertising to support these things. So the kind of traditional firms didn't pay a lot of attention to this tech stuff that was sort of safely out in Silicon Valley. But now, nobody can afford to ignore it because the implications and the impacts are kind of coming across the economy. So again, if you think about the way we organized things in the past, it was very much material extraction. So I spent about 20 years in the Gulf South in Louisiana, and so it's a very material, sort of natural resource intensive environment, primarily sucking hydrocarbons out of the ground, turning them into intermediate products, or you might get some metals out, and then you create some kind of component assemblies, and then you turn that into, well, in this case, a shiny new BMW, but whatever product you care about. That's a traditional way of organizing production, and probably the metaphor that most of us would use if we sort of were forced to say, well, how would you make a product or a service? You'd say, well, I'll gather some inputs, I'll add some value, I'll put it all together, I'll try to get somebody to buy it, and then as long as they pay more than the sum of all those costs, we've done something useful. The problem with this is it tends to be rigid, and these relationships tend to be enduring. Now, if you had studied the auto industry, say in Kirka 1980, 1990, that all would have been viewed as a good thing. These sort of long-term supplier relationships would allow you to co-innovate and co-develop, and then that would actually reduce transaction costs going forward. So this notion that you would want to have short-term spot markets for complex things would be sort of silly, because you could never get the complexity, and things are difficult to measure, especially when you're doing engineering development with suppliers. What's happened is a lot of the complexity and basic building blocks are getting embedded into systems, this sort of general purpose modular technology that we heard about in the last hour, and are becoming systems upon which I can take technology, or I can take sort of contracting relationships and repurpose them into new and different things. What's also interesting is that these systems end up creating not just the ability to co-innovate, if you will, but also to market. So now I can start to reach across a network and then access a set of sort of end markets that any smaller sort of supplier, innovator, developer, content creator would have had a hard time getting access to. And so again, to use Moshe's language from yesterday, transaction costs are going down kind of across the board, because a lot of fixed cost, and think of that as server farms if you want to use a technological sort of example, or think of it as the basic core building blocks of IT, you just wouldn't fund those. It used to be that 20 years ago, sort of the first thing if you wanted to do some kind of a startup would be, well, if it's information intensive, I'm going to need a rack of servers. There's $10 million. Well, nobody would pay that anymore. I can get that kind of power for about 20 bucks with an Azure or an AWS account and just spin it up. And then sure, if you get to sort of Netflix style scale, then buy your own stuff. After, of course, you grew up hosting on top of a direct competitor. So that's really different. And then over time, what ends up happening is if I was to build out a system like Google, I'd have started with just us, the searchers, and then the innovation was this kind of PageRank algorithm, much better than Alta Vista, just using sort of search terms, because people actually had to vote by doing something hard, which was to link. And then if you were the New York Times, your vote counted a lot more than sort of my little website from my school or something. Then the monetization happened by opening up on the ad side. So now we had two sides transacting. And then, of course, that gets complex. The advertisers don't necessarily know how to work together or be coherent across sites. So then a whole kind of set of assisting firms moves in. So anybody that searches for a camera on one site will then be blessed with the echo of the camera for the next week or two. Compliments of companies that are sort of optimizing how long to show it to you before they give up. So this is a slide that I shamelessly borrowed from a guy named Irfan Ganchi, who's had a product for Uber. And he spoke for something that I co-chaired last summer. And if you start on the left, that was kind of this, the obvious metaphor of we're going to organize drivers and riders. And the technology stack to make the left side work is actually pretty interesting. So they call it this hyperspatial, hypertemporal kind of algorithm or problem that they have to solve. But to break it down, it's essentially 5 million optimization problems that are fairly complex that you have to solve every minute with the relatively simple goal of matching supply and demand. But of course, it's time variant, spatially variant. And so that system was this kind of this classic two-sided network. But then they took a look at that and they said, all right, now we have all this technology, we have all these relationships. So now we're going to do sort of an Uber pool, which looks a lot like the left one. And that's a slightly more complicated product. But now they're going to innovate and move into sort of this last mile logistics system. And that's what's happening on the right. And they're taking that same set of technology and then becoming more multi-sided. And then instead of just kind of riders and drivers, you start adding complexity into the system. And that's the sort of thing you see a lot. And if you take a system like LinkedIn, which many of you probably have profiles, the LinkedIn system will be, again, fairly similar. Starts as social media, gives you an incentive to sort of be softly on the job market. No, I'm not really on the job market. I'm just on the social media system. And yes, my information is perfectly up to date. Then you open that system up because what it really is a job and search, sort of an executive search firm. If you look at most of the revenue for the system, it comes from down there. But of course, it wouldn't have had any value to that side of the market until you had aggregated a sort of sufficient thickness of the actual professionals themselves. And then lots of other stuff comes on board once this system is in place and the users are there. Of course, starting like this would have been madness, and it would have died. So you don't start that complicated of a system because none of this network effect flywheel will get going. So when we think about platforms, we think of them first as a set of rules and architecture. And so people, I think, especially those of us with computer science backgrounds, we want to go immediately to the technology. Let's talk about the stuff. But I think it's worth stepping back and saying, well, actually a lot of this is rules and sort of the road and contracts. So if you think about something like an Airbnb system, I'd say, well, sure, it's got this ability to match supply and demand, but they actually solved a couple of important financial problems. they thought they could do everything with reputation systems. They said, well, we'll just rank each other, and that will solve this kind of problem of bad behavior, and we'll just screen. And of course, that turned out to fail, and lots of bad stories happened. People trashed apartments, you got bad apartments. So they then internalized the insurance. And that actually was solving a transaction cost problem. And they said, well, if you do it once, and then you can replicate in a default contract, now I've reduced the transaction costs for what would otherwise be difficult for us to trust one another. And then because that system is there as a backstop, it was able to grow in kind of unprecedented ways. The openness is the part where you allow the system to kind of capture effectively a lot of spare capacity that's in the economy. And so that spare capacity comes in a couple of forms. If you think about something like an Airbnb, it's just a lot of empty space that the transaction costs made it impossible to expose to a market. But then the system, once it was in place, was then able to bring that spare capacity to market. And then if you're investing in hotels or other structures and you actually have to finance them or, God help you build it and own it, that's a difficult proposition because then you're sort of dealing with marginal cost versus all of the cost. The other area where you get a lot of spare capacity is just sort of in innovation. If you think sort of 100 years ago, and I'll touch on this in a little bit, a lot of innovation was sort of corporate-led, things like the AT&T labs or the Max Planck Institutes, or I worked for GE for a long time. We had a corporate research and development sort of arm. But that doesn't make a lot of sense now if you've got these reusable building blocks and you can just give those out as default contracts to anybody that wants to come and play with the Lego blocks. And then if they can do something, there's a ready-made market and they can just sell through. So that ends up sort of tooling up innovation at a much faster rate. Of course, with the downside that these firms that are at the nexus of all of this tend to capture most of the value. And so we have these fabulous systems and machines that we've built for creating inequality, as I think we've seen in the data that's already been shown. The other thing that the systems are designed to do really effectively is to internalize network effects. And maybe it's, and then to try to get the pricing right, in effect, not to drive participants away, and then to try to figure out who's a bad actor, and then kind of use the architecture and the rules to exclude them. And just a really simple kind of supply-demand curve. If you think about platforms, you can call it network effects, you can call it a demand-side economy of scale, but effectively what's going on is that as users come, the systems get more valuable. And not just in aggregate, in a linear way, but in a nonlinear way, because it gets more valuable per transaction. It's creating better matches, and so those better matches mean that every time I use a system, I get more value from it, as Carlo, as Moshe, as Peter, as Hans, as Helga join the system. And so that goes back, I think, to something Helga showed on, in these transformations, do we sort of see this natural trend toward monopoly? We'll see. I mean, on the car sharing things, I'm really skeptical because I don't think the network effects are that strong and the switching costs aren't. But in other settings, I am concerned. So that'll open up a lot of regulatory kind of options, assuming we can upskill that community. So if you go back to this, we're sort of used to classical supply-demand. A lot of these systems have a supply-side economy of scale because of the heavy fixed cost nature, which then means that as I kind of spread those fixed costs over more users, average cost falls. So that's the kind of monopolistic supply argument. If you combine that, and so think of an operating system. First copy of a new operating system, $1 billion. Second copy, 1 cent. 2 users, $500 million, 1 billion users, it's $1. So it's kind of that logic. And if you add to that logic, oh, by the way, the system has greater value as more people use it, then that pushes out the demand curve. That's this trend toward aggregation, concentration, and monopoly that we can see from place to place to place. These are just price quantity curves. And so the idea here is that the supply, if we can have just fixed costs, the average cost per user just comes out. So that's cost. And then the demand side, that's the network effect that's pushing it out. So that's the demand side economy of scale. And so, normally you'd say, well, if demand is going up, then if we have average costs or sort of marginal costs increasing, that would be fine, but we'd expect price increases. If the costs are fixed, we're just going to drive down average cost. And so it tends toward concentration, but for 2 reasons, because of the demand side and the supply side. And that gives us these giant sort of quasi-monopoly firms that we've seen pop up, that are really similar to the steel companies and the railroads we saw a century ago. So now I want to shift and just talk about a couple of firms that have kind of exploited, or at least one of them, some of these kind of ideas and principles. So if I were a retail analyst, I would know which distribution center belonged to which company. So one of those is Walmart, one of those is Amazon. And at Amazon's founding, it was really a system that was designed to more efficiently match supply and demand for physical stuff. And so one of the problems that they had to solve was the optimization of the stuff. Now, the best firm, arguably, on planet Earth at this, at least 20 or 30 years ago, was Walmart. And so they were really good at running a logistics supply chain at low cost. So I used to live in New Orleans, and we had Hurricane Katrina happen about 14 years ago. And there were sort of 3 things that worked. One was the US military, because they could bring their own power and water and food and bring it in on helicopters. So they were sort of infrastructure independent, so that was good. The other were actually the churches, because they had these sort of informal networks. And the third was Walmart. Yeah, and you could put the microwave relays up on them. And the third was Walmart, and literally that became the de facto point of distribution system in the whole network. And so all the Humvees were sort of aggregated, and everybody kind of set up and concentrated there. So they were really good at this stuff. However, if you take a different view, and this is a view that a friend at Georgia Tech put together, this takes the programmable web. At the time, there were about 13,000 cataloged APIs that firms made publicly available, which really meant you could hit it and it wasn't just private behind a firewall. It doesn't mean it's free. You still have to sign up for it, create a developer account, do the OAuth and the handshake and all that kind of stuff. These are not unique clusters, which makes it really hard for him to publish this stuff in academic journals, but it makes really pretty pictures. And so here, clusters like social media, job search, e-commerce, cloud, enterprise, storage, feedback loop, payments. And so if you take, again, this view of Walmart and Amazon, at some early point in Amazon's history, they were running the same kind of a firm, minus the end node of the customer facing. Now let's take a look at the open API view. So this takes a data view of the economy, at least the economy that's sort of openly addressable. And there you see 2 incredibly different firms. One of those firms, before it bought Jet.com, had essentially one open addressable API. God knows what they were doing with it. Now, it's not that they don't have great IT. Of course they do. You can't run a world-class logistics supply chain without world-class IT. So they had almost surely, I haven't gone and looked at it, but modular architectures and sort of nicely chunked systems that allowed you to do updates and development in all the sort of ways that you would expect. The departure was that Amazon kind of took all those sets of capabilities and said, well, if we have to solve these complex problems, lots of other people have to solve these complex problems, so let's just create that as a part of the offering. And so they literally took this system that had been developed and grown up over time as an atoms optimization system and said, let's just dice and slice it, sell it all addressable by APIs and machine-to-machine interaction, and now we have a completely different company. So if you want to buy shelf space at an Amazon warehouse, that's easy. Your computer can do that for you. Just try to do that for Walmart. You know, it's probably possible because some of that is vendor-managed inventory, but it's going to be through those older, longer-term contracting relationships as opposed to just a one-size-fits-all, low transaction cost type of a system. And so with that as background, you can think about the changing nature of the firm and sort of what we're seeing. And we call this kind of a firm inversion, where a lot of the value add starts to occur outside the four walls of a firm. And I think you alluded to it yesterday when you went through the market cap per employee. And it's not that the number, and for a lot of the firms, take Uber for example, it's not that there are fewer people in the system. It's just that they don't work for the brand firm. They're sort of more loosely aggregated or affiliated. So this is a bunch of work that I've done, primarily with Marshall Van Alstyne, who's a buddy of mine from MIT when we were grad students. But the inspiration for this comes from Carlos Baldwin. I don't know if any of you have read things like Design Rules, which would be Carlos's work with Kim Clark. But she did this work looking at the architecture of the products and services in firms, and then asked the question, you know, as those products and services evolve, and they often become more modular, and that was sort of this 15 years ago trend toward decomposition of integrated systems, do the organizations then have to also adapt and mirror the production and innovation processes of that modularity? And so that predicts the organization ties within a firm, project, or group of firms will correspond to the technical dependencies. And that captured our imagination, and so we thought a lot about that. I think a couple of other sort of echoes to the past are things like David Noble's work on America by Design that really went through the growth of the industrial lab, kind of Kierkegaard World War I, and talked about the centralization of scientific knowledge and then why things trend toward monopoly as a result. And that's really a closed innovation system, and we're seeing just a complete break apart. And then about 7 years later, you had this seminal piece of work from David Teese that essentially was pretty skeptical about the notion of a small inventor's ability to ever capture much value from an innovation, because without the complementary technology and access to markets, they were kind of at the mercy of the name brand firms. Think like Ford. So who was it, that guy that did the intermittent wiper? Sort of spent 30 years going after Ford, trying to get a payment. You know, pretty much that was his life's work, and I think he got like $20 million, a third of which probably went to the lawyer. He'd have been a lot better off letting that one go and doing something else, probably, but he was vindicated at the end. But that was sort of the prediction that David made. But I think that's changing. And so, you know, some of the most important questions anybody asks in a firm is kind of, how do you create value? And do you do it alone, or do you orchestrate the work of others? And you know, we know that large firms have all these advantages of scale, market access, R&D, and so you know, why ever more efficient? And of course, you know, we know this from a long time ago. This is kind of this information asymmetry argument, where there's kind of localized knowledge that no central firm could ever have, and so if you can distribute the solution to problems in time and space, then you know, a focal firm can tap a set of ideas from people it doesn't know. So this isn't new. But the new puzzle is, markets were common, sort of one end, and vertically integrated firms were common. So sort of think market commodities over here, vertically integrated firms over here, but we didn't have these platforms that sort of are some kind of quasi-formation somewhere in the middle, and that's what we've seen pop up. And the reason that we think so is you've got a lot of little network effects that in the past transaction cost overwhelmed. And so think about the village market, Kirke, the year 1000. It's not that supply and demand didn't sort of value the participation of the other side. That's a network effect. It gets more valuable. It's just that the transaction cost of hauling my crops or my animals, a day meant that I could only go to one. And so it was naturally limited in scale. Well, what's happened is, in lots of instances, those limits have disappeared, which was effectively a transaction cost, and then the little itty-bitty network effects then become the relevant thing in the economics, and so you get this explosion and growth. And that's where the platform firms kind of come into play. So we did a bunch of kind of economic modeling, and I'm not going to bring any of that up because this isn't the right audience for that. But the essential notion is if you have this kind of stock, think of it as some productive capital in a Paul Romer sort of growth model kind of framework, you'd say, well, I could take some of that productive stock and keep it for myself and sell it, or I can share that. And in a lot of cases, what we're seeing is that firms are taking costly innovations and then effectively open sourcing them, but not they don't have to, but effectively making those openly available to a wider group of participants to then build on top. And they're making this trade-off. If I keep the knowledge proprietary, then I can sell just that. But if I make that as sort of open stock available for others to build on top of, sort of shared platform core technology, then maybe I can act as landlord and then just tax sort of what happens in the economic activity that takes place. And so, in lots of cases, vertical integration makes perfect sense because there just isn't enough innovation capacity in a particular sector that it would even matter. But given enough external actors, then it makes sense to open those systems up at the cost of potentially not being able to directly sell, but instead to be able to reap. I have to not go too close to that speaker. Instead be able to kind of reap the benefits of what goes on top. And so we've got a couple of levers, and this is interesting, and it gets to your point about sort of the skepticism over the ability of governmental entities. If you think about copyright, it's effectively infinite in an economic sense, and yet a lot of innovations aren't valuable for more than, pick a small number, months, years. So some of these systems will promise some sort of intellectual property type protection to the developer base for, say, 18 to 24 months. And then they say, after that, we might fold it into the core. We might not, but we reserve the right to. So this is exactly the SAP white spaces argument. And they say, we're not going to make a contractual promise. But if you think about what's going on there, they're kind of tuning two things. They're tuning the duration of intellectual property protection, and they're tuning the amount of openness, sort of how much capital stock do I make available for others to build upon versus what do I simply keep in-house. And that metaphor can explain a lot of things like Tesla's sort of open sourcing patents or IBM doing a lot of contribution to the open source code bases. And so that's really interesting to us because we're like, there's no way that any government could do that because tuning those parameters are sort of temporally dependent and they're technologically dependent and they're market dependent. And so the idea that the government is somehow going to get that right is sort of ludicrous. And so one of the advisements is, well, be careful in your regulatory frameworks if sort of these firms are internalizing these effects correctly and they're not abusing dominance, maybe you don't want to break those up just on general principle. But that's sort of one thought. So we did some other modeling, but the basic point is the developers would never want to participate in such a system because you have an uncertain draw when you're doing innovations. And if you happen to have created the really valuable one, you're never going to want to contribute that back to the common code base for others to build on. You want to capture it. And so that's this role then of platform as IP rights sort of arbiter and can sort of shorten the duration of IP rights for others to then build. And we've seen tons of systems. You know, the operating systems are legendary, and disk defragmentation and sort of spell checking and dictionary services. And even earlier on, just connectivity to the internet used to be application dependent, and that was stupid, and then it became a core and shared service. So lots of interesting implications for competition policy because, you know, sort of where the firms are in the system is going to end up mattering. So, you know, our hypothesis essentially is that, you know, for lots of regimes, vertical integration is better, but when there is kind of innovation and productive capacity that can be orchestrated that's sort of spare out in the market, then it probably makes more sense for these systems to evolve and go open. And we've seen that. Let's see. Lots of questions. And how much more time have I got here?
Well, it's almost gone.
Okay, it's almost over, so I'm not going to ask too many of those. So what are some implications? So, you know, luckily, we had Jim yesterday go through some of this. But I think one important issue that pops up is this notion of data nationalism. And if you kind of buy that a lot of the growth of these systems is ephemeral and that they're really operating on the very small per transaction network effects or per user, and the reduction of transaction costs that makes it possible to kind of manage and internalize and capture those, you got to be pretty careful in sort of taking those systems down. And so, you know, the EU privacy regime makes a lot of sense, and I'm actually thrilled for things like GDPR and PSD2 because these are our policy experiments and innovations, and we'll kind of see what works and what doesn't, and then hopefully import those. You know, there's zero appetite for that sort of thing in the US today, but things could change, and maybe there will be in the future. You worry, though, about splintering these up. That's happened. China pulled the plug on GE's remote monitoring of its industrial power generation sets and said, no, those are national assets, data as oil, if you will. And so those tech centers and you know, monitoring things all have to be done in country. And you know, that can stop the platforms, and we've seen that. Certainly anybody that's tried to use Google or Facebook in China has sort of failed. Beware fragmentation. This is sort of the EU platform anxiety picture, which says, oh my, you know, there's North America. These are all blown up a bit. This is a couple years old, but you kind of get the idea. So where am I going to land here? So here's where I'm going to land. I'm just going to land on, you know, we're beginning to see a lot of effort in creating data markets. Platforms are uniquely positioned to capture data. You know, are there going to be regulatory responses that say that has to be shared? And I think that'll be dependent. You know, in some markets, if the sort of scale of data to enter is astronomical, like search, that's no longer a contestable market. But other things, you know, autonomous vehicles, we've learned that there are 250 firms. So that sounds like a contestable market. Lots of people have the data. But that'll be narrowing, and I'll stop there. I'm getting the stop now look.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for
insights. And first question. Sorry, to have a more gender balanced set of questions, I urge everybody to ask questions.
So I want to ask about, about regulation. So Uber and Airbnb in particular are two corporations whose basic business model was to break the law.
Yep.
Because both transportation and rental housing is regulated in almost any locality that definitely in the West that I can think of. And so I would say when you have a corporation whose basic business model is to break the law, we have a name for it. We call it a criminal enterprise. And in fact, we have a special law for it. It's called RICO in the United States, right? A special law that was designed because people knew that it was harder to fight criminal enterprises. and yet the timidity is just mind-boggling into say, oh, well, what can we do? This is innovation. And no response to really corporation whose basic business model is break the law. Any insight on this timidity?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and so so let's play the flip side.
Is,
so
my analysis
no,
wrong?
it's not. Well, it's a little stark,
Yes,
and it's
is.
always fun to go black and white. But you might say, so if, and so Ben Edelman would make your point. So he's studied a lot of these regulatory systems and writes and says effectively, these are criminal enterprises, and how can we have this innovation system that's built upon, directly violating the law? Then the flip side is, and he said you should go change the law first and then innovate. And I'm skeptical, because I think what ends up happening is the law followed the innovation. So you're right about Uber. It was illegal for about 12 months at the beginning, and then it dropped to 6 months, and then it dropped to 1 month, and then it became legal. And so what happened is the regulation caught up to the innovation. And if you had never had a framework in which you could try things that were perhaps gray,
So,
I mean, if you're really going to be stark, we're never going to change anything ever, because there's always some sort of constriction.
But the point is, Uber at least has a clever kind of political game plan, which is we'll provide service which is so good, there will be consumer pressure to let us continue what you are doing.
Sure.
Okay?
Yeah.
That's really
and the flip side was regulatory capture made the prevailing service so bad.
Yes.
That
So that's why people hate the taxis and they love Uber.
of course, as you say, very clever.
But so in this case, you have local player, the city, the consumer that live in a city that loved Uber. Airbnb doesn't have the same thing, because Airbnb does not serve the local market.
Yep.
And so I just don't understand even politically. And now, they're continuing with political fights, they're not paying local taxes. I mean, the whole thing, it continued for years. And still nobody has, almost very
Well,
few
and they're
cities-
large enough now that you've sort of run the experiment. And so I'd say, sure, regulate them. I mean, that's no longer, an issue.
and
the small
still-
spares.
And still they're able to get
So I'm not gonna
away
defend
without
that one.
regulation.
But I think, in terms of the experimentation of the business model, I'd be really careful in preventing that. But once these systems get to scale, then it makes sense to regulate. Maybe that's the one-liner.
I would like to jump on this question from a different perspective. So
Okay.
you talked the law, which I think the same. Yeah, we can organize the law. But going back, you mentioned the main theme was lowering transaction costs. So I understand this.
Yep.
And then we look on these big internet companies as the innovators. My thesis is everybody of us, which goes now out of the door and sells any product which is around for half price, will be a perfect businessman. And everybody, and will become rich. And everybody can do so of us if we don't pay tax, if we don't pay insurance, if we don't pay regulation costs, if we don't pay the societal costs, what we are organizing to live together in a society. So in a very open, very free market where everybody can do what he wants, we have different rules. And we have this on the market now. Very urgent, not even urgent. We are now step by step trying to catch up again, and now we invent new rules, for example, for Google and Co. We invent a rule for privacy protection. Now we are increasing the transaction costs again. We try now to organize us as a society. And this discussion, that's for me the question for, I wasn't here yesterday, so I don't know what you have discussed, but for this overall discussion, what's really going on in our society is not happening. This interference between new technology, use of technology, society. It has some reason that we have regulations. It has some reason that we have tax. It's not nonsense. It is there for some reason. Suddenly we came up, it's innovative if we just get rid of it. So a little bit we are playing with our basic rules of a society and nobody's discussing it. So as a last example, a very concrete one, I think the whole world we have seen this hype on virtual currencies and blockchain. I think the whole scientific world is very much also was in favor of, we don't need banks, we have now our own money. So only one theoretical question.
Okay, I was going to say, let's have a
just
question.
One question. No, that's the question. If tomorrow in every country, if all the Austrians, for example, will have their main savings in money in virtual currencies, and somewhere in the world something happens, and the money is away. We don't have, the customer is losing his money. Who is then to blame? What is happening then? All these people become back again to the society. And the question is...
No, that's too diffuse. I'm not going to try to defend that. We could spend a day on cryptocurrency.
No, the question is...
A question.
Technology, science, everybody is working in this field. And we are ignoring this very important relationship between impacts on society and impacts of the use of technology.
So stop there. And
for all these platforms, what you mentioned.
So I'm not even going to fight with you. I agree with you that we've built machines, if you will, and by the machines I mean these social technical systems, whose behaviors we don't understand, and whose impacts we're only beginning to kind of see. So we wouldn't even argue about that. And I'm not going to defend, sort of Airbnb once it's gotten to scale. I would defend them, as little experiments before they have big impacts.
Two short questions.
Yeah.
Where do you see the vulnerability of the inverted firm? Second question, would you say the mafia is a platform model avant la lettre?
Oh, I like that. Is the mafia a platform firm? Yeah, one that's, I think, in Moshe's argument. So sure, and it can get away with all kinds of things, and then you need a policy and regulatory response.
Also in terms of the business model.
Yeah.
There's many mafias. But
the vulnerabilities. So those, I think, come mostly in policy. So I think when there's sort of assumptions about the free flow of data that can be pretty easily upended. And so I'd be a little careful in building some of these systems under those assumptions. We can talk more.
So I would like to thank both speakers for very, very interesting talks that actually talk to each other in more ways than meets the eye. I think I would like to amend the discussion that we just had that focuses on business models that break the law to a question that maybe asks whether the categories and instruments we have to address are even fitting these practices that we now see. So there are lots of harms occurring by data use that are not due to anyone breaking any laws. So there can be business models that are inherently problematic, not because they break laws, but because they cause other types of harms. Some of the harms that Helga also outlined in her talk. And there is work going on in Cardiff, for example, by Joanna Redden and colleagues who are now drawing up a repository of data harms. So my question is, how can we legislate that in the broadest sense of the word? We we talk a lot about the tragedy of the commons, Hardin, 1968, but Hardin wasn't really asking how can we prevent the tragedy of the commons. He asked how can we legislate for temperance. So how can we legislate for temperance in this world where harms occur not only from business models that break the law, but that are problematic in other ways. And I will stop by saying, and here's where I would love to hear what you think, that I think one of the problems is that transformative data, to avoid the notion of big data, transformative data practices don't lend themselves to individual focused ways of protecting interests that our law and the way that we think about not only data protection, but that our law operates with. So maybe we need more communal, collective ways of thinking that don't only focus on sort of individual interests and individualize the relationship between the data user and the data subject.
So what I like in the European context is the notion that we each have ownership rights in our information. The complexity of sort of on the regulation side or designing that is that, you know, the value of your data is dependent upon mine and vice versa, and its combination with technology. And so it's difficult to assign a value to the data that you create in isolation, and that's really difficult then for companies to regulate. So when I started this, I was much more Pollyannish. Sort of 20 years ago, I would say I was a technical optimist. And in many ways, I still am. So think about, we're about at the end of coal, for example, because the costs on wind and solar have dropped so fast that forget the capital cost of coal plants, the operating costs are now going to exceed what the renewables within just a few years. So that's going to be really a big change in the world. So kind of forget about the war on coal. It's already been fought by fracking and now won by wind and solar. But things about the political disruption, I think, are really scary. And there we don't, you know, sort of the policy response would probably be to add transaction costs and to prevent information cascades. I don't know how to do that, but that's a really big issue. The other is that if you can micro-target sort of messages to each of us as individuals, we can exploit sort of our predisposition to believe things that aren't true. You know, you could find something that fits with my worldview and convince me of something that isn't true in a very personalized way. That's one of the bombs that we've built in the system, and I'm not sure how to diffuse that.
So let me follow up about your aside about Netflix. So in my reading of the literature on innovation, there seems to be an oscillation between creating products which have interfaces that allow innovation on both sides of the interface independently, and then the benefits of integrating it and optimizing across both sides. And I was wondering whether you think that the current situation with the disaggregation and the APIs is a temporary situation, or it's something that's likely to actually persist as a model of firms to the future?
Yeah, so Netflix is a great example because it has a lot of sort of platform equalities, except it's closed on the supply side. So I would actually argue that they're earlier in their evolution, sort of like Amazon was when they were retailer before they opened up as market. So if I was going to design Netflix as a platform, it would be much more like YouTube, user-generated content, except at the pro side. So you would open it up to independent developers, you'd provide sort of talent management, film studios, cameras, et cetera, and sound stages and editing, and then you would truly have opened that system up.
Okay. Maybe.
No, you know, because right now their spend is double-digit billions of dollars on content, so they're dealing with vertically integrated studios, and so that would be a reasonable place for them to kind of go after, so I wouldn't be surprised.
Okay.
I have two more in the pipeline, but you should be pretty short.
Yes, my question short is, have you been working on the sector of health and care already? And I quickly state two sites where this could be very interesting. So one thing we see in drug discovery, in the traditional sort of clinical linear pathway, it's not working, and there is open innovation models coming up, there's crowdsourcing of clinical trials, etc. So that's one interesting The other one is Apple Health, etc. So there is, I think one could say, a combination of horizontal and vertical things going on. The horizontal thing is the platform with health apps and real-world data, etc. And the vertical one is the question: how is Apple going to deal with the heavily regulated health markets with the insurers as a third party? And one option might be just to buy these and offer Apple Health insurance, and then you have your...
Yeah, so the healthcare, especially in the U.S., is I think you'd be better off doing some of these innovations, honestly, in single-payer systems. But Google Health tried this a decade ago and failed miserably because they went to the individuals. None of us have sort of on our thumb drives a complete map of our health history that they could then bring to one of the technology companies. So they just started on the wrong side. They should have been negotiating with the healthcare provider side and the insurance companies, and then rolled it out sort of a la open table to the consumers. So that was a kind of a launch issue. And then in terms of the drug discovery, yeah, I think as a metaphor, there are tons of sort of closed science-based systems that will probably open up more.
There's one last.
Thank you. I will end this discussion with a stupid European question. We had this discussion before about taxes and society and regulations, and I just want to have your ideas about that. There are some voices, mainly coming from the US, saying, well, perhaps we don't need such a thing as society anymore in a completely networked world, where all the middlemen and the state are not necessary anymore. Is this just a kind of ephemeral discussion, and or is this a fundamental belief in some of the big companies? I just have no idea about it.
So the place I hear that most is that blockchain will somehow take down all of the sort of name brand companies, and we'll just do peer-to-peer transactions. So my friend is a chief economist at one of those firms, sort of laughs at that and says, you have to have an awful lot of faith in civil institutions to enforce contracts in a peer-to-peer sense that the platforms are able to do through rules and architecture. I think it'll be a long time. On the tax side, I think you're way further ahead. And honestly, if anything, I think the platforms and the way that they help firms avoid taxes are actually going to end up driving American society more towards European, because if you don't have employer-based healthcare, then you have to have that be nationalized. You have to have a whole different tax regime. And so I think that these firms are actually exposing holes in our own society that, and lots of cracks that we're going to have to fix up unless we want even more chaos. So, yeah.
Thanks again to the speakers, and maybe more questions that are still burning during coffee.